Well, thank you so much for that nice introduction, Dr. Arnold. I am delighted to be here today to give this talk. Thank you so much for the invitation. And I'm also really grateful to be part of this distinguished series. So, let's make sure this works. I like to begin every talk by thanking everyone that was involved in the research that I'll talk about today. It really is a collaborative effort. I'd like to begin by thanking my colleagues here at the University of Missouri St. Louis, in particular Dr. Steve Bruce, as well as the graduate and undergraduate students in my lab, some of whom are pictured here and some of whom are here. Thank you so much for coming. I'd also like to thank my colleagues in Wisconsin and Iowa, as well as the internal and external funding that supported this research. So, in everyday life, we spend a lot of time thinking about ourselves. And it's the case that researchers suggest that we spend up to 50% of every day lost in thought. Now, that may be hard to believe, but just think back to the last time you were doing something that was really well practiced, like driving. Maybe you were driving to work or to campus this morning, and your mind, besides, of course, focusing on the road and the cars around you, right? Your mind probably drifted to thoughts about the past, like a conversation that you had with a loved one the night before, or something you had for breakfast this morning. You might have also been planning for your day. For me, on my commute this morning, I was thinking about the class that I had to teach this morning, as well as giving this talk this afternoon. You might have also drifted off to thoughts about the future. So you might have been thinking about something fun that you have planned this weekend. For me, I was thinking about how excited I am to go visit my family for Thanksgiving next week, right? And have a whole week off. Yes. So these are all examples of self-related thought, which we define as this process of turning your attention inward to think about your own thoughts, memories, feelings, and actions. And William James described this as our stream of consciousness. But in everyday life, we probably experience this as our internal dialogue that we really only become aware of when we're not doing anything in particular, like driving. You may have noticed the last time your thoughts drifted off, maybe right now, that some of those thoughts varied in terms of their emotional tone. Some of those thoughts might have been positive, like thinking about those positive thoughts about yourself, like, don't I look good in this new sweater? Right? You may have also had more negative thoughts about yourself, like thinking about how you wished you would have done better on that assignment, or you wished you wouldn't have said that thing to your spouse, right? So maybe it says something about me, but the research that I focus on and that I'm interested in is really understanding these negative self-related thoughts. One of the questions that drives the research in my lab is really trying to understand how these everyday negative self-related thoughts can become prolonged and persistent, like they do in different psychiatric disorders like depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's take the example of an experience you might have had with an everyday negative self-related thought after something bad happened. So maybe you received a bad grade on an exam or an assignment. Maybe you got some negative feedback from a colleague or a supervisor. Maybe if you're in academia, you got a manuscript or grant rejected. Unfortunately, that's more and more common these days, right? Importantly, there are individual differences in how we respond to those negative events and how that then leads us to talk differently to ourselves. In my lab, we use a combination of different psychological measures as well as brain imaging to look at how we can identify these negative self-related thoughts in the brain. And so for those psychological measures, we might look at things like giving people questionnaires or giving them computer tasks. For brain imaging, we can look at brain structure using a method called magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. We can look at brain function using functional brain imaging or functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI. And we'll talk about that today. In the current research in my lab, we really take a precision health approach to understand how there are individual differences in those levels of negative self-related thought and how that might then further be represented within the brain. Can we identify those neural correlates, those brain patterns associated with that negative self-related thought? And can we use that information to then predict why or how people respond to different types of treatment? It's also the case that I'm interested in determining whether we can further improve well-being by targeting either negative self-related thought through psychotherapy or mindfulness, or can we target those brain patterns that are important for negative self-related thought through non-invasive brain stimulation techniques. So why is this important? Well, we know that individuals who engage in more negative self-related thought are more likely to develop different psychiatric conditions, in particular depression and PTSD. It's also the case that the rates of depression and PTSD are relatively high globally. And this has, of course, significant costs to the individual, obviously, as well as to society. So I would argue that it's really then important, given how high the rates are of depression and PTSD, as well as the associated risk, that it's important to be able to identify these reliable psychological and brain-based markers of these disorders in order to help develop certain types of treatments, as well as hopefully prevent these disorders. So first, I'm going to talk a little bit about the sets of brain regions or systems that are important for self-related thought in general. So one of those systems within the brain that's important for self-related thought is the default mode network. You're probably going to get sick of hearing me say default mode network. But it's a network that was discovered really by accident. So it was early functional imaging studies. They were most interested in understanding how brain activity changes in response to a cognitive task. So let's take the example of this attention task here on the left, where you're asked to identify the red vertical bar among the other red and green bars. In these types of experiments, you'd also have a passive viewing condition or a control condition where you're presented with the same stimulus, but you're not doing anything in particular. And so something interesting they noticed is that when you're subtracting out this passive condition or this baseline condition, you see consistent activity or deactivation in the default mode network. And that includes these regions of, that are highlighted here, the medial prefrontal cortex, and I don't know, okay, no. I'll just move. This is the medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, and inferior parietal lobule. I wanted to say for those of you who aren't neuroscience experts that don't worry if you forget the names of these. I won't be giving you a quiz later. All right, so research that came after this was really interesting. So it used a new method at the time called resting state fMRI. In resting state fMRI, individuals go in the scanner and they're asked not to think about anything in particular. So resting state is sort of a misnomer. They're not sleeping. And hopefully they're not sleeping because that would mess up the images that we collect during those scans. So these researchers were able to show if you take out the brain activity in these regions of the default network, you can show on that graph below that those lines are very similar, right? Those lines are highly overlapping, and that suggested to researchers at the time that these regions constituted part of a network. So they really were a network of brain regions that were communicating together. But this didn't tell us anything about what does this network do, right? What's the functional significance of the network? And so what they initially did was they asked people when they were in the MRI scanner doing those resting state scans, what were people thinking about? You know, ask them. And it may not be surprising to all of you, but people were engaging in all the different types of self-related thought that we talked about. So they were self-reflecting, they were retrieving memories from the past, or they were thinking about the future. But again, this really supported this idea that maybe the default network is important for self-related thought, but we needed different evidence to really support that idea. So we needed to be able to take people in the scanner, have them actively think about themselves, and look to see what brain regions were active. And so they did that across a variety of different tasks. And so just to orient you, on the upper left, we see a task that involves evaluating personality traits and engaging in what we call self-referential thought or self-reference. So you decide, do those personality traits describe you? So I'm dependable. Yeah, I think generally, right? Okay, yes. Am I polite? Yeah, most of the time, right? Depending on the audience. And so when you do a task like that, that increases the activity in the default network, in particular the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate. You also see when people are asked to retrieve those personal memories from their past or autobiographical memories, that regions of the default network are active, and those are shown in red, if you can kind of see that from the figure on the lower left. And then these figures show that people who reported mind wandering more often had greater activity in these regions of the default network. And later studies had people doing tasks where they were reporting that they were mind wandering, and again, you show activation in the default mode network. So all of these studies were really important in providing that support for this idea that the default mode network was important for self-related thought. But this is getting a little technical, but we can look at this evidence and say, okay, these regions are active, but it's only really a correlation, right? Are these regions really necessary for self-related thought? And so that's a question that can be answered using the lesion method. The lesion method in humans can be used to look at whether brain damage to certain areas, and that brain damage could be due to stroke or due to some surgical resection, so removal of an area. And you can look at how that changes their behavior. And so in this series of studies that I did in graduate school and afterward, I was interested in understanding whether regions within the default network were really necessary for self-related thought. And so predicting that if we have damage to these areas, I thought it would disrupt self-related thought. They're really having fun over there in the other room. Okay. So here is the first study that we did. So we used a similar personality trait judgment task, and we were able to show that patients with damage to specifically the medial prefrontal cortex, which is shown in the figure over there, you can see the overlap of lesions in that group where there were a lot of patients with lesions that overlapped in the medial prefrontal cortex, and they showed a reduced self-reference effect. So specifically, we looked at this memory advantage that we have if we think about information in relation to ourselves, and they just didn't show that at all. So that was really interesting. Next, we looked at patients with lesions all over the brain, and we gave them an autobiographical memory questionnaire that assessed their memories from childhood all the way up to adulthood. And we were able to show those regions in red are areas that, when damaged, were associated with less detailed autobiographical memories. So if they were retrieving a memory from, say, the day that they graduated from high school, it would have a lot fewer sensory details. So they wouldn't be remembering exactly how they felt. They wouldn't be remembering, what kind of day it was. They wouldn't be remembering sort of the smells associated with that. So it was, again, just sort of a vague autobiographical memory that they retrieved. Again, I'll point out here that it wasn't only the medial prefrontal cortex, but now we do see the posterior cingulate cortex, which I'll point out here, as well as the inferior parietal lobule. We also see other areas, but that's nuance that we don't have time to talk about today. Happy to answer questions about that later. And then finally, we looked at mind wandering. So we had participants with, again, damage all over the brain. We gave them a self-report questionnaire that assessed how often they were mind wandering, and we were able to show that they had decreased mind wandering. So this image is a little maybe challenging to interpret, but just to say that the results were in sort of that purple color, and the default network there is shown in that orangey yellow color. And so what we saw is that damage to the inferior parietal lobule and medial prefrontal cortex, damage to those areas was associated with reduced report of mind wandering. Okay. So now that we've talked about the brain systems that are important for self-related thought, specifically the default mode network, in the next series of studies I'm going to talk about research that we've done to really investigate whether these same brain systems are altered in depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. So this first study we did in collaboration with a clinical psychologist at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and we looked at negative self-focus and resting state fMRI in women with different depression histories. So there were women with no history of depression, all the way up to women who were currently depressed. We measured negative self-focus using an interesting task called the sentence completion task. This is a task where we present individuals with different sentence stems, and they complete them however they want. For those clinical psychologists in the room or people who are therapists, you may know that this is a projective test. But what we do later is we go back and we code those responses for whether they're self-focused or whether they're focused on other people. And we also code that emotional tone that we talked about earlier. So are those responses more positive, negative, or neutral? And I wanted to just give you a sense of what kinds of responses that we get to see the difference between positive self-focus and negative self-focus. So someone said, I'm happy with who I am. Others think I'm always happy and smiling. And someone with a more negative self-focus said, I am pathetic. Others are disappointed in me. So it is really qualitatively different. And in fact, these different responses were from individuals who are currently depressed, so just had more severe depressive symptoms. So in terms of the outcome variable for this study, we used the proportion of those negative self-focused responses out of all the different sentence stems. And so first we were interested in just looking at the relationship between negative self-focus and depressive symptoms to see if there was that relationship. And indeed, consistent with our predictions, we found that individuals who had more severe depressive symptoms also had more negative self-focused responses on that sentence completion task. So we see that strong positive correlation. Next, we were interested in looking at whether negative self-focus was related to connectivity or communication between brain regions in the default network. So is more negative self-focus associated with more connectivity, more communication in that network? And so consistent with our prediction, in the image there in A on the left, it shows that there was increased connectivity between the medial prefrontal cortex and the inferior parietal lobule when people were more negatively self-focused. So they had more of those responses. But it was interesting, it wasn't just the default network, right? I said you were going to get sick of me saying that. Well, there's also another network that's sort of interesting in terms of negative self-focus. And that's these attention-related brain regions that are important for paying attention to the external world. And so those include regions like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the precuneus. And so again, those regions are important for helping us to pay attention to the external world. And so greater negative self-focus was associated with more communication between the default network and those attention-related brain regions. So in terms of summarizing the results of this study, we found this association between negative self-focus and depressive symptoms. We also found that negative self-focus was related to greater communication or connectivity within this default network that we know is important for self-related thought. But we also found that greater negative self-focus was associated with greater communication between the default mode network and the frontal parietal network, or that attention network. And so why is this important? Why is this interesting? Well, this is interesting because in healthy individuals, normally these networks are not positively correlated. They're not active at the same time. Normally they have opposition, so that when you're thinking to yourself, you're self-reflecting, usually you're not paying much attention to the external world, especially if you're actively engaged in sort of reflecting. And vice versa, if you're actively engaged in something in the external world, then you're turning your internal dialogue off, right? But in depression, we think, at least from these findings and others, that in rumination, there's this impairment in the ability to shift your attention away from that ruminative self-focus. And so you're sort of co-opting that network, that attention network, to ruminate, to focus on yourself instead of focusing on the external world. Okay. So in the next study, this was again in collaboration with Heather Abercrombie, and some of this work was led by one of my former graduate students, Sally Pessin, where we looked at rumination and variability in brain activity in depression. So what is variability in brain activity? We can measure variability in brain activity in a variety of different ways, but we can also measure it using fMRI. So we can look at changes in the BOLD signal, or blood oxygen levels, during that resting state condition. So here you can see in these two graphs differences between individuals that have high variability in brain activity versus low variability in brain activity. So for the image on the left, maybe you can see that those lines are showing that there's a lot of distance between that line and sort of the average activity for that individual, right? There's a lot of variability, there's a lot of variation. Whereas the individual who has low variability, the amplitude of that signal is very small. They're not changing much in terms of their activity over time, right? So why is variability important? Well, we think it has some sort of functional significance. So that higher neural variability is associated with more cognitive flexibility, and that individuals who have higher variability then might be able to adapt to changing situations and changes in the environment, and maybe think outside the box. Whereas someone with low variability in brain activity may just think in one way. They sort of get stuck. And so that seems a lot like the symptoms of depression, right? And it may also be very similar to an individual who's stuck in focusing on those negative emotions or negative self-related thoughts, like in rumination. So in this study, we were first interested in looking at changes in variability in brain activity in relation to depression. So are individuals who are depressed, do they have changes in that variability? And we did see that they had reduced variability in brain activity, and we looked really across the brain, and so we identified some regions outside of the kind of typical default network regions we talked about, but we also identified the inferior parietal lobule as showing lower variability in brain activity, just like we would have predicted. Again, so this is important because, in depression, we know that this network is altered. And so there are changes and abnormal activity in the default network in depression, so that's consistent with that. In the next analysis in this study, we were interested in seeing whether we can use this information about variability in brain activity, now looking at activity across different networks, not just the default mode network, but other attention-related and other networks within the brain, to see if we can then use machine learning to predict who is in a certain depression group, right? So can we predict depression history? And so using a random forest machine learning model, we were able to accurately predict depression history with 74% accuracy. Interestingly, although again, we included regions all over the brain, right? The most important variable in the model was from the default mode network. And this is the ventral anterior cingulate cortex, but importantly, that overlaps just with the medial prefrontal cortex that we've been talking about. And this is interesting because in depression, we see greater activity in this area, and it's also an area that after treatment tends to normalize in individuals that respond to treatment. So I thought this was particularly interesting that we can use this measure of variability to then predict that depression history. In the next study, we wanted to see whether rumination was also related to variability in brain activity, and we looked at brain regions that are typically associated with this negative self-related thought or rumination. And what we found is that more brooding rumination. Brooding rumination is a certain type of rumination that seems to be more common in depression. It's really this sort of passive focus on your negative emotions and negative self-related thoughts. And so if they were brooding more, they had less variability in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. Again, of that attention network that we talked about, the frontoparietal network. This is important because in depression, this region has been shown to be less active, so hypoactive, and it also is a region that's targeted to treat depression with non-invasive brain stimulation. So transcranial magnetic stimulation, which applies a magnetic pulse, is FDA approved, an FDA approved treatment for depression. So has some implications there. So putting this together, we showed that there was reduced variability in the default network in individuals who had a history of depression. And we also showed that rumination was associated with reduced variability in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex of that attention-related brain network. I think this is interesting, again, that we identify both of those same networks, even though we looked beyond those areas, right? So this does suggest that maybe depression is associated with the abnormalities in brain activity in the default network, but also communication between the default network and the frontoparietal network through functional connectivity. So all of these studies were in depression. What about PTSD? Do we see similar changes in these brain systems in PTSD? So in the next study, this was done with a colleague here at the University of Missouri St. Louis, Dr. Steve Bruce, as well as a former graduate student, Tashia Floyd. And we wanted to look at how brain structure and function was related to rumination in post-traumatic stress disorder. Here we looked at women who had a PTSD due to an interpersonal trauma. And so first, again, just like the other study that I showed you, we wanted to look at whether rumination was correlated with symptoms of PTSD. And so we did see a strong positive relationship between rumination and PTSD, so that individuals who reported ruminating more often had more severe PTSD symptoms. And that was regardless of whether we look at that in terms of all of their symptoms, or if we break down those symptoms into what we call symptom clusters, like re-experiencing or avoidance. Next, we were interested in understanding whether rumination was related to brain structure. And so specifically, we looked at the volume of regions that overlapped with the default mode network. And so those regions are shown there. So we did find a positive association between the volume, so the size of the isthmus cingulate, which is located very near to and part of that posterior cingulate cortex. And so that individuals who ruminated more had larger isthmus cingulate. Next, we wanted to look at brain function. So we looked at the relationship between rumination now and resting state connectivity, that communication between brain regions. And so we used that region that we identified as associated with rumination in our brain structure analysis as a seed region in our resting state connectivity analysis to see what regions is this area connected to and how does that relate to rumination. And so interestingly, what we found is a negative association, so that individuals who ruminated more often had less communication between that region of the default network and the precuneus. Now, interestingly, this region of the precuneus overlaps both with the default mode network as well as the frontoparietal network that we've been talking about. But I think this is interesting because you might be saying, wait a minute, I was expecting a line to go this way, right? And so this is something that I'm very interested in and that we'll talk about sort of at the end is why is it the case that in PTSD we see this opposite relationship, so that more rumination is actually associated with decreased connectivity within the default network and between the default network and frontoparietal network. So putting this together, we were able to show that greater levels of rumination were associated with more severe PTSD symptoms. And we also showed that rumination was related to larger volume in the default mode network and reduced connectivity or communication within the default network and between that default network and attention network. And my interpretation of this so far is that it could lead to sort of the same types of impairments, right? We're still talking about the disruption in the normal communication between those networks. So it could still be possible that in individuals with PTSD who are ruminating more often, they just can't switch out of that. They can't switch their attention to something else. They're just focused on that negative emotion or negative thought. So finally, I was interested in applying the lesion method again, but to understand sort of this overlap that we're seeing in the brain systems that are important for self-related thought and the brain systems that are important for negative mood, and using a lesion method approach to address that question. So this was a study done in collaboration with Dr. Aaron Bowes and Dr. Nick Trapp and Joel Bruss at the University of Iowa. And we wanted to see whether lesions to the default mode network were associated with reduced mind wandering and reduced depressive symptoms. So by way of a short background, we know that individuals who mind wander more often, even healthy individuals, tend to feel worse. They have more negative mood. And that might be sort of surprising, but they've done these studies where they text people throughout the day for a week or more, and you can see that individuals who report mind wandering more often also report more negative mood. It's also the case that if we look in individuals with depression, we see that individuals who have more severe depressive symptoms also mind wander more often. So this has led researchers to propose that there may be this reciprocal relationship between mind wandering and negative mood, and there's some support for this in the literature. So mindfulness-based stress reduction programs have been shown to reduce both mind wandering and depressive symptoms. And we further know that if we induce a negative mood sort of acutely, so if we have people watch a sad movie, they mind wander more afterward. And so I was interested in determining whether if you have an individual who has both reduced mind wandering and reduced depressive symptoms, do they also have brain injury that overlaps with the default mode network? So do they co-occur? So in this study, we used a k-means clustering approach, which is just a fancy way of saying we put the data in and we looked at what data points clustered together based on mind wandering and depression, which were our outcome measures. And we found, interestingly, across this sample of 68 patients with brain injury, that there was a target group of individuals that had reported both mind wandering less frequently and reported fewer depressive symptoms. And so one question, of course, that we wanted to know is, where is their brain injury? Is there evidence that that overlaps with the default network? Indeed it does. So here we find, this is an overlap map of the lesions in the sample, and we see mostly that it overlaps with the medial prefrontal cortex. So here we see that purple colors and kind of that pink color are where there are more lesions in the group. So they had more lesions overlapping with the default network than the other brain damage comparison groups, in this case, the non-target groups. We also were interested in seeing, okay, it's only lesioning the medial prefrontal cortex. What about communication with other regions within the default network? And so we used a new approach, which is lesion network mapping. It's a bit complicated, but in short, we take brain imaging data, resting state brain imaging data from healthy individuals, and we use that lesion location as a mask in a resting state connectivity analysis to basically see how that damage affects communication to other brain areas. And so we were able to show, this map is showing that, maybe not surprisingly, this region that's damaged in this target group is highly connected to other regions within the default mode network. And so those are the areas that are shown in red. Again, we see medial prefrontal cortex, posterior cingulate, and inferior parietal lobule. And then again, that's just a reminder of the default network that we talked about earlier. Okay. We also conducted an exploratory analysis to see if that target group also experienced other changes in cognition, so working memory, other changes in mood, or other changes in personality. And we found across those different measures, the target group reported significantly fewer anxiety symptoms only, as compared with the other non-target groups. So putting that together, this and the other findings that I showed you suggest that default network regions are really necessary for self-related thought and mind wandering, as we saw in this study, as well as depressed mood. It's also possible, given our findings, that the default network may contribute also to anxiety symptoms, since we saw that overlap. So in terms of a general summary, sort of summarizing all of the studies that we talked about today, I was able to show you, sort of consistent with previous research, that more negative self-related thought was associated with more severe depressive symptoms and more severe PTSD symptoms. We also identified the brain patterns associated with negative self-related thought in both depression and PTSD. And here we identified something that is interesting, that maybe it's the case that there's dysfunction not only in the default mode network, which we know is important for self-related thought, but also the communication between that network and attention-related brain regions. And so that the alteration in the communication between those networks may be particularly important for this negative self-related thought, like rumination and this negative self-focus. But again, turning back to the findings, we found sort of opposite relationships, right? So in PTSD, we saw that there was reduced communication within the default network and between the default network and that attention network. And in depression, we saw the opposite, that there was increased connectivity. So this is something that I'm particularly interested in following up on to really understand, for example, what happens in individuals who have both depression and PTSD. So if we look at comorbid conditions, what do we see? And what implications does this have, if any, to treatments, right? If we think about psychotherapy, maybe that doesn't have to change, but what about brain stimulation treatments? Should we be targeting different areas? There currently is not an FDA-approved non-invasive stimulation treatment for PTSD. So this has clinical implications in terms of targeted treatments. So I think these findings suggest that maybe we could target that negative self-related thought through psychotherapy or different mindfulness-based programs. There are psychotherapy programs like rumination-focused cognitive behavioral therapy that does target negative self-related thought, but there are also other therapies that may also apply in this case. Maybe we can also target these altered brain patterns that are associated with negative self-related thought. So as I sort of mentioned earlier, there already is an FDA-approved non-invasive stimulation treatment for depression that targets this region of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, or DLPFC. And research suggests that it does change the communication between the default network and that attention network, the frontoparietal network. But fewer people have really looked at how does that change how people think about themselves, right? So that's something that I'm particularly interested in following up on. And also, what if we target other areas? Why are we targeting the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex? Would this also work if we target the medial prefrontal cortex, which we saw in several studies, or maybe the inferior parietal lobule, right? So that's where my current work is headed, is really trying to use that precision health approach to really understand whether we can measure self-related thought and measure brain activity, so variability in activity and connectivity, to predict who's going to respond to treatment, right? With the prediction that if we're able to decrease that self-related thought or negative self-related thought, we should see an increase in variability in brain activity and a normalization in the communication between the default network and that attention network. And thank you so much for your attention.
going to run the microphone for Q&A. We're also open and taking questions on Zoom, so I'm going to start off with one from Zoom, and then hopefully maybe one of you will have a question. But one of our friends in Rolla wants to know that you mentioned something about magnetic pulse treatment. Can you tell a little bit more about what that is and what it's used to treat and how effective it is?
Yes, absolutely. So let's go back to this slide. So there are a number of different non-invasive brain stimulation techniques, but TMS, or transcranial magnetic stimulation, applies magnetic pulses through using this coil that's shown here. So a coil is applied to the outside of the scalp, and it tries to target, as I said, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And through that, those magnetic pulses, it stimulates neuronal activity. So it stimulates brain activity, so it increases it. Yeah.
Thank you, Carissa. It was very nice.
Great
talk. Throughout the talk, you referred to some things like brain lesions and injury. And I was wondering what your definition of that was.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've examined the brains and see if there's actual injury and damage. Okay.
Great question. So we use brain scans and information from neurologists about, say, what caused that brain injury in an individual. So typically it is the case that it's going to be a stroke that has caused that brain injury, and we can confirm that by giving them a structural scan and MRI scan. And so then people, take a lot of time they basically have to trace out that damage in order to be able to do these lesion studies, to be able to show that sort of overlap. And it's hard, again, there are issues with alignment and things like that. Like, everybody's brain is different. So, but yeah, that's how we do it. So we trace that out. Yeah, good question.
Any other questions?
I really appreciate this presentation. It was
Thank you.
amazing.
It's a lot.
I'm curious, what populations were the individuals tested in the brain scans? What ages were they from? And then are these findings applicable to children?
Good question. That's an excellent question. So if I have, most of them, so they were adults. If I have the extra slides in here. So here's the participants from the depression studies. So you could see their age. They were on average about 27, 28 years old. And then if we go, the patients with PTSD, they were a little bit older, so they were 32. But I think that this would generalize to other ages, so younger individuals. And so I do have some data where we looked at mind wandering in children and how mind wandering in children related to depressive symptoms. So we had kids 8 to 13 years old, and we showed a positive relationship, just like you see in adolescents and adults, so that when those children are mind wandering more, they report more depressive symptoms. So it seems like that relationship is there, although it wasn't maybe as strong. It was a smaller sample, so I'd want to see, replication of that. I'd want to see larger samples just to make sure it wasn't just by off chance that we found that. Yeah.
Thank you for the interesting talk. I have a related question. So it's really cool to see these unique brain patterns associated with depression and PTSD, and how you use machine learning to be able to predict depression history. Do you think these patterns are existing vulnerability, in which case you can even predict future depression onset, or do you think it's more like a consequence of having depression currently or in the past?
That's an excellent question. So I think it's, obviously my data can't fully speak to that, but I think that we have this, in the depression studies, we had a group of individuals who was not currently depressed. They were not currently depressed, but they had a history of depression. So that would get at sort of that tendency. Is it something that is an underlying vulnerability? And so based on that, both individuals that had a past history but no current depression and the currently depressed group had reduced at least variability in brain activity, which does suggest some potential vulnerability. That would be something that you would see in both. But since it was so similar, I don't know whether that would then predict the subsequent depressive episode. But yeah, I mean, that's a really important question. Yeah, and I think maybe also the sentence completion task looking at negative self-focus kind of speaks to that. So if you look at the proportion of negative self-focused responses in that group and you compare it to the currently depressed group, you see something intermediate. So you have people with no history of any depression, they're not reporting very much negative self-focus. And then you see sort of in between, the people who aren't currently depressed are kind of negatively self-focused, at least significantly more than the non-depressed group. And then the currently depressed group has the most. Yeah. Good question.
Thank you for the topic. A couple of things. One, did you take genetics into consideration? And two, I don't think it was in the scope, but I'm just wondering if there was any nutritional deficiencies.
That's a good question. So we didn't look at that. I think genetics is important, but we just didn't have those data. We do have some data about epigenetics in the sample of women with depression. So we could sort of look further into that to see how much these types of negative self-related thought or these patterns of brain activity may relate to these markers. But the markers that we chose, of course, were based on sort of like the goal of the larger study, which was to really look at stress. So yeah, but I think that's a great point. I think it would be important to look at that. Do you have any ideas about nutrition that you were thinking about?
Nothing in particular, but I know that there's so many. I heard a study that said that we live in a society of nutritional deficiencies because of what we eat versus, all the processed foods and contamination from microplastics and.
Yeah, absolutely. I can say that recently I became aware that there was a study, it was like kind of a small study, I think it was with 40 participants, but they showed that people who took probiotics actually ruminated less. And they were more focused on positive things. So I really want to follow that up in a larger sample to see that, because that would be really cool. We can just give everybody probiotics. It'd be fine.
Thank you. I'll have Dr. Ronald finish it up.
So I'll go next. So there actually was a very nice question online that I was planning to ask, slightly different, but kind of the same point. So it was anonymous attendee, but they asked about individuals diagnosed with PTSD and depression. And from memory, none of those individuals had been tested with imaging. And my question builds on that is, how far off do you think we are where we can do these kind of images, whether using machine learning or AI, as better ways to diagnose and better ways to track treatment? Because sometimes we lump things in one big bucket. And so are there different forms of depression or PTSD that need different interventions, whether it's cranial magnetic stimulations or others? So my question was, where are we now, and how far off are we? Just speculating, do you think where we could actually get to the point and use that to deliver precision interventions treatments?
So that's a really great question. So there are people working on that. And so I think they've come a long way in determining, are there different symptom presentations of depression in particular? And they're able to show, okay, patients with depression that have more of that dysphoria, more of that negative mood, tend to benefit most from treatments that target the default mode network. So some of those are psychedelics, some of those are antidepressants, TMS, and then, patients that have more of the cognitive symptoms of depression need a completely different approach, and so they tend to benefit more from, there are new medications out there, I don't know the precise names, but that have been shown to be successful in randomized control trials to treat the cognitive impairments. And then their neural correlates are going to be obviously different from what I've shown here. So it is pretty specific to kind of the symptom profile. So I think, you know, I don't know about sort of like the ability to then use that information to then predict that treatment response afterward, or is this truly the best treatment for that individual? So I think that will take far longer, obviously. And of course, scans are very expensive. So hopefully, we'll be able to identify these neural correlates of behavioral measures. Can we give someone a computer task? Can we give someone a questionnaire that is close enough? And then be able to then kind of tell them which treatment approach to take. Yep, yep.
We kind of have a similar question, but along the lines of, do you know how your results are being impacted currently by ADHD, ADD, or autism type of diagnosis?
Yeah, great question. So we know that, yeah, in ADHD, you know, even if your attention is focused elsewhere, you have these symptoms that are distracting you. There are different types of symptoms in ADHD where you might have an internal distraction, like you're thinking about all these different things, and so you get distracted, versus getting distracted by things that happen in the external world. So that's definitely something I'm interested in. I just haven't, you know, I've kind of been targeting or focusing on depression and PTSD, but I think it definitely has relevance in terms of those findings. And then in autism, I think autism is interesting. Of course, it's a spectrum, so there'll be a lot of variability, but I do think in some cases, research has shown sort of a reduced self-focus or self-reference in autism, and some of the early imaging work showed that the default network was less active. So there is sort of that connection, but again, I don't know that I want to make too much of that given, again, the variability in sort of symptoms and presentation of autism. Yeah. Oh, yep, there's one more.
I don't have a question, but I'd just like to thank you for bringing up these wonderful ideas to our attention.
Thank you so much.
Look at all the questions that are generated in terms of future research.
Yeah, absolutely.
Very exciting area.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much. Appreciate that.
I love that question because it is about it's about asking questions, and I, you know, our goal is really to set this up to kind of tease the curiosity and trigger the question that might be actually the breakthrough with the next experiment and so forth. So you really hit the mark with this talk. Amazing and really beautiful work. And as a token of our appreciation of your work that's impacting health here in Missouri and beyond, we want to share this. It was made from lumber here in Missouri.
Oh, cool. Thank you so much. Thank you.
So please do consider submitting abstracts for Pathways. It really is a very collaborative symposium, and it's very targeted towards junior folks, students, postdocs, and we would love to have you there. And also, we're looking forward to 2027 when we can be here in St. Louis. Thank you. See you in January.
Thanks so much. Thank you. Thank you so much.